A slap struck her cheek, and sparks danced in her vision. She swallowed the cry, fighting to escape. If she pleaded, they would mock her. If she resisted, they would brand her wicked. Eager, hardened faces pressed in close. She tasted blood and held her chin high. At the circle's edge, one man watched like granite. His gaze never wavered. He studied the hands that harmed her, not the tears they sought. The widow tried to smother her hope. Hope had wounded her before. Still, it crept in, silent and tenacious. Why would a powerful rancher risk his reputation for a woman the entire town aimed to break? Maggie Hart lived in a small house just outside Dry Creek Crossing. She rose early to move before most doors unlocked. She washed quickly, pinned her dark hair tightly, and pulled on a plain dress that hid what it could. The gold ring on her finger no longer brought comfort. It was a mark for the town to see. It declared her husband dead and her still here. 6 months earlier, Caleb Hart had collapsed on their kitchen floor. The doctor called it heart failure. The town distrusted simple answers. People whispered that a wife's silence meant guilt. They murmured poison and nodded as if it were fact. Maggie remembered him returning drunk and raising his fist. Then his face twisted. His hand clutched his chest, and he fell hard. Maggie stood over him, trembling, too stunned to scream. After the burial, the town decided Maggie was the problem. She learned survival rules and followed them like scripture. She used back alleys and kept her eyes down. When women muttered, she didn't reply. When men stared, she averted her gaze. Some days the harm was minor. A shoulder slammed into hers as she passed. Other days it was blatant, a shove near the well with a voice saying she deserved it. That morning, a sharp, rapid knock hit her door. Prudence Harlow stood on the step in a fine hat and a neat smile. She spoke of prayer and forgiveness, but her eyes remained cold. She said the Ladies' Aid Society was meeting and Maggie should come confess. Maggie refused, soft but firm. Mrs. Harlow warned that the town's patience was wearing thin. Then she mentioned the bank, saying debt collectors showed no patience with widows. When she left, Maggie felt smaller than her own doorway. Wade Kincaid watched the town from a low rise outside the creek. He used an old brass spyglass, his hand steady. Through the lens, he saw Maggie leave her house with a basket and stiff shoulders. He saw how people made space around her, as if her grief could stain them. His foreman, Louis Ortega, rode up and spoke quietly. Louis said the bank was being pressured to call Maggie's debt, and saloon men were talking about a public lesson. Wade lowered the spyglass and exhaled once. He told Louis to follow close and stay quiet. By late morning, the market square was crowded with wagons and voices. Maggie chose the busy time deliberately. Crowds made it harder for a single cruel person to corner her. She paid for potatoes and dried beans without looking up. The old farmer took her coins as if they were filthy. A mother pulled her child away as Maggie passed. Someone crossed themselves, as though Maggie carried a curse. Maggie tried to finish quickly, but she felt eyes tracking her regardless. Near the well, an old woman stumbled, her pain clacking on stone. A voice shouted that Maggie had tripped her. Maggie hadn't been close enough to touch her, but the lie stuck because the town wanted it to. People gathered, faces bright with blame. Prudence Harlow stepped forward and spoke about safety and godliness as if cruelty were a duty. Hands closed in behind Maggie, blocking her retreat. Prudence knocked Maggie's basket from her arms, and food scattered into the dust. Maggie bent to gather it, and a shove slammed her into a post. Maggie tried to pull free, but more hands pressed her from behind. The circle tightened, and the air grew thin. Maggie saw faces she recognized, neighbors who once borrowed sugar, now watching her as if she weren't human. She lifted her chin anyway. Dignity was all they hadn't taken. Then a rifle cracked once, sharp and final. The square fell dead still. Hooves struck stone in a slow, steady rhythm, and the crowd parted on instinct. Wade Kincaid rode in on his bay stallion, rifle in hand, thin smoke curling from the barrel. Wade walked to Maggie and crouched beside her scattered food. He picked up each piece and placed it back in her basket, patient, as if time were his. When he stood, his eyes met Maggie's, steady and clear. He faced the crowd and spoke in a deep, plain voice. He said the next hand laid on Maggie's heart would answer to him. He didn't shout, and he didn't need to. Then he turned to Maggie and lowered his voice. He said she could refuse what he was about to do, and he would still walk her out of danger today. Wade lifted his chin and spoke so everyone could hear. He said Maggie Hart would be his bride, and under his name she would be protected. Silence spread across the square. Even the birds seemed to pause. Prudence Harlow's face tightened with unconcealed rage. Lewis watched from the edge, ready for trouble. Wade offered his arm to Maggie, steady and patient, giving her the choice in front of everyone. Maggie stared at him, heart pounding, because a name could be a shield, but it could also be a cage. If she took his arm, would she be protected, or would she owe him a life she couldn't give? The market square remained silent after the rifle shot. Dust hung in the sunlight, and even the wagons seemed to pause. Maggie kept one hand on her bruised cheek, the other on her basket handle. Wade didn't rush or pull her. He offered his arm and waited, as if the choice were hers alone. Prudence Harlow stood at the circle's edge, lips tight, eyes sharp. Maggie looked at Wade's steady gaze and stepped toward the only safety she could see. She took his arm. A low murmur rolled through the crowd, half anger, half fear. Wade crouched and gathered her scattered food, placing each piece back into her basket as if it mattered. Then he guided her forward through the parted bodies. Luis Ortega rode in close on Wade's left, scanning hands and pockets. Someone muttered that Maggie was cursed, but the voice sounded smaller than intended. Wade spoke once, calm as Riverstone, telling them to step back. No one argued. Maggie kept her eyes on the boardwalk planks and walked as if she belonged to the air in front of her. Sheriff Dean Carver's office smelled of ink and pine sap. Dean looked from Wade to Maggie, his jaw working as if chewing trouble. Wade told him to open the registry and write it down, now. Dean asked if Wade understood what he was doing. Wade said he did, and he wouldn't let rumor shape the story first. Dean asked Maggie her full name, and she said it clearly. He asked if she agreed to marry under territorial law. Maggie thought of hands on her arms and voices calling it virtue. She said yes. Dean asked Wade the same, and Wade said yes without blinking. The wax seal pressed down with a soft crack that tightened Maggie's throat. Dean spoke the legal words and signed as witness. When they stepped onto the boardwalk, the crowd still waited, hungry for an ending. Prudence Harlow raised her voice and called the marriage a stain on Dry Creek Crossing. Wade stopped and faced her, his voice low and steady. He said a decent town wouldn't strike a woman in daylight and call it righteousness. The crowd shifted at that. Everyone knew how much of their money touched his name. Maggie saw men glance at each other, doing quick calculations. Prudence's eyes flickered, and her smile returned, thin and dangerous. She said, "The Lord sees all, and no man could buy his way past judgment." Wade replied that the Lord might see all, but so did he. He said he saw every shove and every lie, and he had a long memory. Prudence fell silent, and the quiet felt like a promise of more trouble later. Wade didn't wait for her next move. His bay stallion waited, restless but trained. Lewis held the reins while Wade helped Maggie mount behind him. Wade's hand remained firm on her forearm, then he stepped away, giving her space even as he protected her. Wade swung into the saddle and guided the horse toward the road out of town. Maggie held the saddle horn, not his waist, because she didn't know what closeness was permitted. The town's eyes followed them like thrown stones that couldn't reach. As the buildings thinned, the air felt wider, but her chest remained tight. Wade spoke without turning back. He said she could stay in her own house if she wanted, and he would still keep his word. Maggie answered honestly. She said, "A house doesn't protect you when a town decides you're the enemy."
She said they would wait until Wade rode out, then come at night, quiet and cruel. Wade nodded once, as if he'd already pictured it. Maggie asked him why he'd watched her for so long and done nothing sooner. Wade's shoulders tightened, then eased. He said he once believed silence could keep peace, and he learned it only kept cruelty comfortable. The iron gate of the Concade Ranch rose ahead, simple but strong, with his brand burned into the wood. Ranch hands paused as they rode through, some tipping their hats, some staring in quiet surprise. A tall woman stood on the porch with gray hair pinned tight and an apron tied firmly. Wade introduced her as Mrs. Dobbs, the housekeeper, and said Maggie would be treated with respect. Mrs. Dobbs looked Maggie over with a hard, practical gaze, then nodded once, as if she'd decided Maggie was a person, not a rumor. Maggie followed her inside,